The morning sun cast long shadows across the agora of ancient Corinth as citizens gathered for what had become a ritual as old as the city itself. In the center of the marketplace, a massive limestone block sat waiting, its surface worn smooth by countless hands, its weight a testament to the burden of justice that defined Greek society in the 5th century BCE. This was no ordinary stone. Measuring nearly 3 feet in length and weighing over 200 pounds, it bore the scars of its purpose, deep grooves where ropes had cut into its surface, dark stains from the sweat and tears of those who had carried it before. The Corinthians called it the lithos iskros, the stone of shame. The crowd stirred as the city guards approached, escorting a figure whose head hung low in defeat. Alexios, once a respected merchant known throughout the Peloponnese for his fine pottery, now faced the most humiliating punishment Greek law could devise for his crime. 3 days earlier, the city's tribunal had found him guilty of pseudo-martyria, bearing false witness in a legal proceeding that had cost an innocent man his life savings. In the rigid hierarchy of Greek justice, some crimes demanded more than mere fines or brief imprisonment. False testimony struck at the very foundation of their democratic society, where a citizen's word was sacred and the courts relied entirely on sworn statements. The punishment had to match not just the severity of the crime, but its symbolic weight. As Alexios was led to the stone, the crowd's murmur grew louder. Children pressed closer to their parents, wide-eyed at the spectacle they were about to witness. Elderly citizens nodded approvingly. They remembered when such punishments were more common, when public shame carried the force of law. The chief magistrate, his purple-trimmed himation marking his authority, stepped forward to read the sentence. His voice carried across the agora with practiced authority. Alexios of the house of Nicomedes, you have been found guilty of corrupting justice itself. As the false words fell from your tongue like stones, so shall you carry the weight of your deception before all citizens of Corinth. 2 guards positioned themselves beside the limestone block, while a third began securing thick ropes around its weathered surface. The punishment was precise in its design. The criminal would carry the stone along a predetermined route through the city's most crowded streets, ensuring maximum exposure to public scorn. But this was more than mere humiliation. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual that transformed individual shame into collective moral instruction. The rope harness was fitted across Alexios's chest and shoulders, the coarse fibers already chafing against his skin. As he bent to lift the stone, his muscles strained against its immense weight. The crowd watched in silence as he struggled to stand, the limestone pressing down upon him like the burden of his guilt made manifest. This moment marked the beginning of a journey that would take him through every quarter of Corinth, past the workshops where artisans paused their labor to witness his shame, through the residential districts where families would point and whisper, and finally to the harbor where foreign traders would see how Greek justice dealt with those who betrayed truth itself. As Alexios took his first faltering steps, the stones scraping against the paved street behind him, few in the crowd understood the deeper currents that had brought him to this moment. His crime was not born of malice, but of desperation, a fact that would make his punishment all the more tragic and all the more instructive about the unforgiving nature of ancient justice. The rope cut deeper into Alexios's shoulders as he dragged the massive stone through the narrow streets of Corinth's residential quarter. Each step sent shockwaves of pain through his body, but the physical agony paled beside the psychological torment of 100 staring eyes. From doorways and windows, citizens emerged to witness his passage, some with expressions of righteous satisfaction, others with uncomfortable recognition of how thin the line between respectability and ruin could be. The story of how Alexios had come to this moment began 6 months earlier, in the very agora where his punishment now unfolded. Demetrios, a wealthy landowner from the surrounding countryside, had accused Lysander, a struggling olive farmer, of stealing irrigation water from the communal channels that fed their adjacent properties. The case seemed straightforward. Water theft was a serious crime in the arid Greek landscape, where agricultural survival depended on carefully managed resources. But Lysander was innocent, and both Alexios and Demetrios knew it. The truth lay in a web of debt and desperation that connected all three men. Alexios owed Demetrios a substantial sum, money borrowed to expand his pottery business during a season when demand had suddenly collapsed. When Demetrios approached him with a proposition, Alexios found himself trapped between financial ruin and moral compromise. "Testify that you saw Lysander diverting water to his groves," Demetrios had said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "Your word as a respected merchant will seal the case. In return, your debt disappears." The weight Alexios now carried through Corinth's streets was nothing compared to the weight of that decision. He had stood before the tribunal, raised his hand to the gods, and sworn to tell the truth. Then he had lied with practiced conviction, describing in vivid detail how he had witnessed Lysander's theft during his early morning travels to the clay deposits outside the city. The judges had believed him without question. His reputation as an honest trader, built over decades of fair dealing, gave his testimony unassailable credibility. Lysander's protests fell on deaf ears. What was the word of a struggling farmer against that of a respected merchant? The sentence had been swift and devastating. Lysander lost not only his land rights, but was ordered to pay massive compensation to Demetrios. Unable to meet the judgment, he was forced to sell his olive groves, the same land his family had worked for 3 generations. He disappeared from Corinth shortly after, his wife and children following him into exile and poverty. For 3 months, Alexios lived with his secret, watching his pottery business slowly recover with his debt erased. But guilt gnawed at him like acid, corroding his sleep and poisoning his relationships. The weight of Lysander's ruined life pressed down upon him more heavily than any stone. The truth emerged through the very prosperity Alexios had tried to protect. His pottery began appearing in markets throughout the Peloponnese, and with success came scrutiny. A merchant from Aegina mentioned seeing Alexios's distinctive wares in a shop the very morning he claimed to have witnessed the water theft, 60 miles away from where he swore he had been. The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Witness after witness confirmed that Alexios had been conducting business in distant markets during the time of his supposed observation. When confronted with the evidence, his careful construction of lies crumbled like poorly fired clay. Now, as he struggled through the agora with the stone of shame grinding against the pavement behind him, Alexios understood the true genius of his punishment. The physical burden was temporary. In a few hours, he would complete his prescribed route, and the stone would be lifted from his shoulders. But the shame would follow him forever, carved into the memory of every citizen who witnessed his degradation. A group of young men jeered from a tavern doorway, their cups raised in mock salute to his passage, but an elderly woman emerged from her house, carrying a small jar of water, which she offered without words. In her eyes, Alexios saw not condemnation, but recognition, the understanding that any person, under sufficient pressure, might find themselves dragging their own stone through the unforgiving streets of consequence. The punishment was designed to be witnessed, to serve as both individual justice and collective warning. As Alexios rounded the corner toward the harbor district, sweat streaming down his face and the rope eating into his flesh, he had become a living lesson in the price of betraying truth itself. The final stretch of Alexios's journey led him down the steep cobblestone path toward Corinth's bustling harbor, where the salt air mixed with the sounds of maritime commerce. Ships from across the Mediterranean bobbed at anchor, their crews and passengers providing an international audience for the conclusion of his punishment. Here, where goods and ideas flowed between civilizations, Greek justice would display its uncompromising nature to the wider world. The stones scraped against the worn stones of the harbor road, each grinding sound announcing Alexios's approach to the merchants and sailors who paused their work to witness the spectacle. Foreign traders whispered among themselves in various languages, some recognizing the ritual they were observing, others learning for the first time how the Greeks dealt with those who corrupted their legal system. Among the crowd gathered at the harbor's edge stood Theron, a young scribe who had been present at Lysander's trial 6 months earlier. Unlike most spectators, he watched Alexios's struggle with something more complex than simple moral satisfaction. Theron had been troubled by the case from the beginning, not by any evidence of Alexios's deception, which had seemed airtight at the time, but by subtle inconsistencies in testimony that only someone trained in legal documentation would notice. The punishment of carrying the stone of shame was ancient, predating even the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes. Its origins lay in the Greek belief that certain crimes polluted not just the individual, but the entire community. False testimony was particularly heinous because it perverted the very mechanism by which society resolved disputes and maintained order. In a culture where the gods themselves were believed to punish oath-breakers, the stone served as both earthly justice and divine warning. As Alexios neared the designated endpoint of his journey, a weathered stone platform overlooking the harbor, his legs trembled with exhaustion. The limestone block had carved a deep groove in the road behind him, marking his path like a permanent scar across the city's landscape. Citizens lined both sides of the final approach, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that such punishments evoked: righteous anger at his crime, uncomfortable pity for his suffering, and perhaps most importantly, sober recognition of their own moral fragility. The harbour master, a grizzled veteran of countless maritime disputes, stepped forward to oversee the ceremony's conclusion. In his weathered hands, he held a bronze stylus and a wax tablet, the instruments that would record the completion of Alexios's punishment and his theoretical restoration to society. But everyone present understood that while the legal consequences might end, the social ramifications would echo for years. With a final, agonizing effort, Alexios dragged the stone onto the platform and collapsed beside it, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The crowd remained silent as the harbour master approached, his voice carrying the formal authority of Greek law. "Alexios of the house of Nicomedes, you have borne the weight of your deception before the citizens of Corinth and the gods who witness all oaths. Your punishment is complete, but your shame remains as a lesson to all who would corrupt justice with false words." As attendants moved to remove the rope harness from his shoulders, Alexios struggled to his feet. The physical relief was immediate. The crushing weight that had pressed down upon him for hours was finally lifted. But as he looked out over the crowd of witnesses, he understood that he would carry a different kind of weight for the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, Alexios would attempt to rebuild his reputation and his business. Some citizens would eventually forgive him, understanding that desperation had driven him to betray his principles. Others would never trust him again, viewing his false testimony as an unforgivable corruption of the sacred bonds that held their society together. His pottery, once prized throughout the region, would be marked by the memory of his crime. But perhaps the most profound consequence of his punishment was its effect on those who witnessed it. Young Theron, the scribe who had watched from the crowd, would go on to propose reforms in legal procedure designed to prevent future false testimony. The foreign merchants who observed the ceremony would carry tales of Greek justice back to their home ports, spreading awareness of how seriously the Greeks regarded truth in their courts. The stone of shame would remain in the agora, waiting for the next citizen who chose deception over truth. Its presence served as a constant reminder that in Greek society, some crimes demanded more than mere punishment. They required public acknowledgement of moral failure and community witness to the price of betraying fundamental values. As the crowd dispersed and normal harbour activity resumed, the limestone block was loaded onto a cart for its return journey to the Agora. The stone itself bore no permanent marks from Alexios's ordeal, ready to serve justice again when called upon. But the citizens of Corinth carried away something more lasting, a renewed understanding of the fragile bonds of trust that held their civilization together and the terrible weight that fell upon those who chose to break them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from ancient history. Like this video if you learned something new about Greek justice, and let us know in the comments what other ancient punishments you'd like us to explore. Your engagement helps us bring these incredible historical stories to life.